Sam Selvon's The Lonely Londoners: Sea Changes, Immigration, and Modernism in Caribbean Literature. Thank you for reading this exciting novel. Sam Selvon's The Lonely Londoners represents one of the most important early works of Caribbean modernism. Its innovative structure and style moved novels of this period into new grounds, showing the world, and England specifically, that Caribbean writers can master language, form, and style in fresh and exciting ways. Moreover, as Selvon and other writers moved from one sea to another, the Caribbean Sea to the North Sea, they ushered in a sea change in Caribbean literature as well. The focus was less on situations and stories on the islands than ones within the country or countries of immigration. These writers also changed the face of British literature as well. In this video, we will discuss Selvon's background, the Windrush Generation, immigration, and modernism. Sam Selvon is considered a major figure in Caribbean literature. He, along with many writers of his generation, migrated or immigrated to Europe following World War II. Originally pushed away from their West Indian or Guyanese homelands due to the lack of opportunity or political persecution, these writers were pulled into England, France, the United States, Canada, and other Western nations, where they could find work and artistic expression. As Shoshila Nasta explains in the Penguin's Classics edition of The Lonely Londoners, quote, like many other writers of his generation, Selvon migrated to London in the 1950s to escape the parochialism of West Indian middle class and to establish an international audience for his work, end quote. Other writers would migrate for other reasons. These immigrant writers in English have collectively been labeled the Windrush Generation, so named because of the HMS Empire Windrush, which was the moniker of the first ship carrying around 500 West Indians to England in 1948. According to J. Dillon Brown and Leah Red Rosenberg, editors of the essay collection entitled Beyond Windrush, Rethinking Post-War Anglophone Caribbean Literature, poets Ian MacDonald and John Figueroa, and playwrights Earl John and Evan Jones, and a slew of novelists arrived during this influx of Caribbean immigration. The novelists include the following, quote, Michael Anthony, John Carew, Wilson Harris, John Hearn, George Lamming, Roger Mace, Edgar Mittelhauser, V.S. Nepal, V.S. Reed, Andrew Sulky, and Samuel Selvon, end quote. For more information on V.S. Nepal, Edgar Mittelhauser, and George Lamming, please watch my videos on my YouTube channel. Of the writers mentioned, Wilson Harris, George Lamming, V.S. Nepal, and Sam Selvon have been seen as the most influential. Each of those four brought new dimensions to English language literature and culture. The other Windrush writers, though, should not be overlooked because they challenged, at the time, and still challenge ideas around, quote, genre, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, transnationalism, and the concept of what local means, end quote, according to Brown and Rosenberg. Indeed, I would encourage you to read all of these writers to get a complete picture of this generation, Britain and the Caribbean. For our discussion, Selvon was one of the first writers to employ creolized English in literature. His mastery of native speech and language dominates his fiction, especially The Lonely Londoners. As one scholar notes, quote, Selvon's initial aim was to give voice to this early immigrant experience, distilling the ordinary language of the people and making it accessible to a wide readership, end quote. With this goal in mind, I think it's safe to say that Selvon achieved it. The Windrush Generation, as a literary faction, begins with the immigration of West Indians starting in 1948 to 1962 or 1971. 1962 marks the year when a new immigration act in the United Kingdom curbed the flow of Caribbean immigrants. Another source considered 1971 as the end of the Windrush Generation. Nearly simultaneous to this migration was the push for independence throughout the West Indies, particularly in Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica. Brown and Rosenberg offer a strong summary of this situation. Quote, the extensive migration of these post-war years took place in tandem with the formation of the West Indies Federation, which served as the official channel of the region's aspirations for political independence until its untimely collapse 4 years after its 1958 inception. Thus, the Windrush years mark an especially poignant period for the English-speaking Caribbean, rich with dreams and controversies about migration, identity, national culture, regional unity, and decolonization. End quote. It must not be understated that these immigrants learned to share their histories and experiences, uniting them under a broader collective, quote, Caribbean or, quote, West Indian or, quote, Windrush identity. This new forged collective consciousness helped to facilitate a pan-Caribbean identity, both within the islands and abroad in the West. As I've already mentioned, immigration began in 1948 primarily as a result of economic conditions and demographic demands following World War II. Nearly 10,000 men and women came from the Caribbean to offer support of the war efforts in Britain. Kenneth Ramshed, writing in the introduction to the Longman Caribbean Writers edition of the book, explains the beginning of the migration/immigration process. Quote, at the end, these men returned home to a disappointing situation. Jobs were hard to find, and the standard of living they could expect in their home islands was much lower than that which they had enjoyed in Britain. There were no restrictions on their entry into Britain, for their passports bore witness to the fact that they were citizens of the United Kingdom and colonies. They began to trickle back to Britain to seek their fortunes and began to write home glowing accounts, backed up by cash remittances, of the varied opportunities available in the booming post-war British economy. Shipping companies, sensing a new avenue for profit, began to offer cheap fares to Britain, and vessels returning to Europe, and the migration developed rapidly. End quote. In other words, the boat train, as Selvon describes, begins its journey to the UK. According to Ramchad's introduction, quote, by 1956, when The Lonely Londoners was first published, the annual figure for migrants from the West Indies had reached over 25,000, end quote. A similar flow of migration occurred in the United States during the Harlem Renaissance for Caribbean peoples. The picture above shows the Empire Windrush and its eager passengers. This slide shows the initial journey from the Caribbean to England on the Empire Windrush. As you can see, this trip took over a month. In this slide, it shows the countries of origin for many of the immigrants of the Empire Windrush. The bar graph indicates that 65% of the passengers had Caribbean origins, from Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, and other Caribbean locations. Jamaica had the largest number of immigrants, which explains a comment in the novel. According to the narrator, quote, now Moses don't know a damn thing about Jamaica. Moses come from Trinidad, which is 1,000 miles from Jamaica. But the English people believe that everybody who come from the West Indies come from Jamaica, end quote. This misidentification signals a poor generalization on the part of the British people. For representation of the Jamaican diaspora in fiction, I recommend reading Zadie Smith's classic novel White Teeth or Andrea Levy's A Small Island. Before we turn our attention to the novel, I want to discuss the lasting implications of the Windrush generation. Let me start with Brown and Rosenberg's summation. Quote, in contemporary Britain, Windrush stands metonymically as a marker for the emergence of an increasingly multicultural national polity, in which the old self-understanding of Englishness as racially white gradually cedes prominence to a newer conception of Britishness, one that strives to include the burgeoning population of citizens who trace their heritage back to the once colonized spaces of the British Empire, end quote. In other words, this generation broadens the boundaries of what Britishness means, allowing more multicultural peoples and experiences to be included in this new idea of Great Britain. Quote, in the Caribbean, Brown and Rosenberg explain, Windrush signals the heady mid-century period in which tens of thousands of Caribbean migrants made their way to Great Britain, challenging the long-standing varieties of empire, end quote. This quote shows the reversal of trends, so to speak. For centuries, empire often worked in favor of the mother country, whereas with Windrush, the colonies got something in return for being subjects in a larger empire. As another legacy, literature of this generation changed Caribbean and British literature. Again, Brown and Rosenberg note that, quote, this generation of male Exilic writers brought international acclaim and regional recognition to the Anglophone Caribbean literature as a tradition, and the concepts and themes articulated in their work have decisively shaped Caribbean literary criticism for over half a century. End quote. In many ways, my videos on YouTube pay homage to the legacy of Windrush, for they call attention to the significance of many Caribbean writers of this generation and beyond. For more information on this generation, please read Colin Grant's Homecoming, Voices of the Windrush Generation, and Ian Sanjay Patel's We're Here Because You Were There, Immigration and the End of Empire. Another key book to consider is Jamaican post-colonial scholar Stuart Hall and his collection of essays entitled Familiar Stranger. Another lasting impact of this immigration was the so-called, quote, Windrush scandal, end quote, in the United Kingdom in 2018, which related to the threatened deportation of many peoples from this generation. The national government destroyed records, leaving these immigrants no way to prove their statuses. Ultimately, this scandal highlights discrimination and its force still operating within Britain. As I hope to have explained, Sam Selvon belonged to the Windrush generation. In this part of the presentation, I want to discuss the novel and its key features. The novel's structure is integral to get an understanding of the book. Selvon's use of vignettes, which at first may seem loose or sporadic, indicates a planning and organization and alignment with concepts in modernism. In the quote above, Ramchad notices that the book may appear, quote, loose or episodic, yet he reminds us that the narrative technique is deceptively brilliant. Quote, from looking at the narrator, we are drawn to recognize in Selvon's novel a tightness of the structure, the way the parts are put inevitably together, subtlety in the development and revelation of theme, linguistic cunning, and an appropriateness in the presentation and deployment of characters, end quote. Fragmentation, along with a larger disillusionment, also provides strong relations to modernism. Selvon's invented new creolized English also aligns closely with modernism. Ramchad also notices that, quote, Samuel Selvon's The Lonely Londoners focuses on the larger body of immigrants of working class status, end quote. Because of this status, quote, Selvon's immigrants inhabit a nightmare world, according to Ramchad. He even describes Selvon's London as a shattering world. Nasta describes the novel stories as tragicomic urban theater, end quote. She continues to explain that the novel's modernistic tendencies, quote, as an iconic chronicle of post-war West Indian immigration to Britain, The Lonely Londoners encapsulates the romance and disenchantment of an imagined city that was both magnet and nightmare for its new colonial citizens, a promised land that despite its lure turns out to be an illusion, end quote. Nasta concludes, quote, mimicking the oral rhythms of a modified Caribbean vernacular, Selvon immediately takes us inside the world of his immigrant characters, creating an intimacy between the storyteller and reader and distancing us from the bleak landscape of an alien city outside, end quote. Selvon's book moves Caribbean literature into new, modernist realms. Before we conclude, let's look at how language works in the book. Ramchad's quote in the slide above explains how each story is different while they share commonalities. I would encourage you to explore a few of these stories to find the similarities and differences. Seeing these will help to reveal Selvon's brilliance. Ramchad goes on to elaborate, quote, the language of the book is not the language of one stratum in the society, not the language of the people, meaning the folk or the peasantry, but a careful fabrication, a modified dialect, which contains and expresses the sensibility of a whole society, end quote. Nasta agrees, quote, in using a creolized voice of the language of the narration and dialogue, a voice which transports the Calypsian ballads of the errant island boys to the diamond pavements of Caribbean London, Selvon not only envisioned a new way of reading and writing the city, but also exploded some of the narrow, hyphenated categories by which Black working class voices had hitherto been defined. Closing the difficult gap between the teller of the tale and the tale itself, Selvon thus finds a means to not only reinvent London, but to reshape its spaces, giving his previously voiceless characters a place to live in it, end quote. Selvon, in other words, gives life to his characters, which in turn gives life to the immigrants of his generation and beyond. This ability has lasting implications as well, according to Nasta. Quote, Selvon not only fashioned an innovative way of writing his unlettered characters into fiction, creating at the same time an ironically nuanced black colony within the heart of the city, but also translated the humorous dynamics of the Caribbean street talk that they brought with them into an international context. In style and content, therefore, it represented a major step forward in the process of linguistic and cultural decolonization. End quote. As you read the book, we see new characters transform from greenhorns new to the city and its customs to seasoned veterans that remake the city and its customs for their own purposes. Nasta concurs, finding that London, in the book, is a labyrinthine city that has casts of ruthless, unlettered characters soon learn to survive in and reinvent. End quote. One strong example of this is the character of Tilroy, who ends up becoming an exemplary character for the entire community, despite his family's loud, numerous objections. In case you missed Selvon's creolized language, most often found in his use of non-standard verb forms and slang, such as the word test for new greenhorn immigrants, I want to offer a few examples. Starting with the novel's first sentence, Selvon ushers readers into a new portrayal of London. Quote, one grim winter evening, when was a kind of unrealness about London, with a fog sleeping restlessly over the city and the lights showing in the blur as if it not London at all, but some strange place on another planet. End quote. This quote speaks on one level to the dangerous environment in London, which was choking of smog in the 1950s, while on another level it signals the unrealness that London is for these immigrants. It may as well be some strange place on another planet for them. Significantly, readers do not get Moses' immigration story within the book, for he arrived prior to the novel's opening. Instead, Selvon gives us a character seasoned by many years. Moses, in many ways, operates as an anchor for this generation, a contact person for the newly arrived immigrant. Because of his position, Moses constantly watches these people transform over time and tells their stories, while relating them to his own story in life. When Henry arrives, Moses briefly, quote, had a feeling of homesickness that he never felt in the 9 years he in this country. This feeling of nostalgia, as the narrator labels, is fleeting because Moses just persists and goes along with his life. Henry's role, both as foil and companion to the seasoned Moses, opens Moses to fresh sets of problems and circumstances. Selvon chronicles these in their first encounter. Quote, now Moses is a veteran who lived in this country for a long time, and he meet all sorts of people and do all sorts of things, but he never thought the day would come when a feller would land up from the sunny tropics on a powerful winter evening wearing a tropical suit and saying he ain't have no luggage, end quote. Selvon's use of creolized English here shows his linguistic mastery, and Moses' stream of consciousness, another hallmark of modernism. In the end, Moses becomes the glue that holds these men and families together. Selvon offers a moment of reflection upon Moses' role and character. The narrator describes, quote, nearly every Sunday morning, like if they going to church, the boys lounging in Moses' room, coming together for old talk, to find out the latest gin, what happening, when is the next feat. Dripping with the creolized English in this passage, Selvon's prose explains how Moses becomes the center of this community. He gives them a spiritual, cultural, and communal purpose. The alt talk, no doubt, in Creole English makes them feel free and happy. I hope that reading this novel has made you feel that way as well. Here are some sources to consider to learn more.